Deicide turned so he could face her squarely. He exhaled a cold breath as his antennas lightly probed her face. She could feel the heat from the tiny red lights at their tips. Fawn watched as the abyss flared behind him, reaching around with her black tentacles to intimidate her. Fawn held herself firm, not allowing a single eyebrow to betray her. She was a wolf maiden, and he was a lonely stray that happened to come across her in the forest. Her eyes never left his, even as he closed the gap between them. She was ready to lash out with all the strength her body could manage, even if it was in vain. She would show this beast her warrior's pride. Now that the abyss was closer, she could hear the whispers that many soldiers had mentioned. At first she thought she had heard children, but they were the giddy voices of women. This wild crosstalk was hard to follow, and Fawn could only determine that it was gossip. Fawn was stewing behind her steady eyes. How could this creature know what it did? It knew about the cute risk-eater cadet she was hoping would notice her, that her anger stemmed from her disgust with the war she was forced to take part in, even the heaviness of her menstrual cycle. She could feel that the abyss's eyes saw through her mask, even if Deicide did not. The abyss wants to force you through a series of progressively smaller holes, Deicide said. Does she make all of your decisions? Fawn said. When their outcomes are trivial, Deicide said. If you don't want me to fight for you, then what do you want? Fawn said. Deicide gently took both of her hands in his. It was then that she noticed his sharp fingers. Fawn lowered her chin, in case the man grabbed for her throat. But as she saw the pleading look in his eyes, she doubted he would. He desperately wanted something from her, and Fawn was sure that she could never give it. She would rather kill herself than live as some man's concubine. He could never have her, no matter what he offered. Your brother's one of my finest risk-eaters. My people's families are always cared for. Nothing you desire will be kept out of your reach, Deicide said. In exchange for what? Be happy in our little fishbowl? What if I want to feel the sun on my face, wind in my hair? There are worse alternatives, Deicide said. I've heard. Is that how you deal with people who don't agree with you? Shove them in those ghettos? Fawn said. Deicide lifted her chin with a thumb and forefinger. I would never do that to the sibling of one of my people. Besides, why waste such beauty? There should be more faces like yours around, Deicide said. Fawn snatched her face away from his grip. Your monster showed me some puppets in my parents' image, Fawn said. Nature has made you pretty and strong, but I have mastered nature. A person who has been handed the tools for success will never beat me, Deicide said. Then why fear me if you have all the cards, Fawn said. For my children, Deicide said. Our children. And then Deicide began to spread his kill box. To hell with you and your fucking magic, Fawn said. Deicide jerked his head back. I admire the gutsy attitude of your family, but after you've pissed and shit yourself and your eyes are bulging out of your skull because I'm squeezing the life out of you, your death won't be any less pathetic when they factor in your bravery. Your brother won't be comforted because you were strong until the end. You'll just be another mindless voice in the abyss, Deicide said, dropping her hands. Fawn held her stare for another moment before she slid off the stone slab. Her fists were tight as she passed through the subtle kill box Deicide had spread. She could feel the abyss behind, mocking her retreat. She wondered if that was all the abyss was, just the mindless ghosts of people that had fallen by his hand. She felt weak, as if Deicide had somehow drained her energy through touch. Her brow was moist with cold sweat, and her lunch was churning violently through her intestines. With every step her foot wavered before it hit the floor, and she began to wonder if she had been drugged. The doors to the library slid open, and she was faced with Rodella. From behind them, Deicide waved her away. Fawn turned down Rodella's offer to help her back to her room. She believed the young soldier was a genuinely kind woman, but there was an unmistakable scent on her that she doubted would ever come off. The smell offended her and made her sick even after she had been on board for several months. It seemed to be everywhere, but stronger around people closest to Deicide. She lacked the patience to deal with it at the moment. Fawn retreated to her room and fell into her rack, wondering what was to happen now. She thought of escaping, but this place was always buzzing with activity, and her face was bound to end up on the corner of every display and terminal within the next few minutes. As her mind raced and her pulse quickened, Alpha burst in with a bewildered look on his face. You fucked up, Alpha said, as he dropped himself down in a chair in the corner. What am I looking at? Fawn said. The best thing that can happen is they send you to a decent district filled with Alberonians, Alpha said. Or they kill me, Fawn said. I don't think they will, but motherfuckers have been killed for less. I'm not gonna let them kill you. You're my blood, Alpha said. I'm not afraid of dying, Alfie, Fawn said. What the fuck are you talking about? You're not dying. We have to go plead our case to the legal department, then dash over to mental health, tell them about mom and dad that you got anxiety about. Alfie, Fawn said. What? Alpha said. I can't, Fawn said. What about mom, dad, and Buck? Alpha said. Fawn threw her hands in the air. I can't be here. I can't do this, Fawn said. And if they could wake them up, wouldn't they have done so already? I never really thought about that, Alpha said. To tell the truth, I never think about it at all. I just do what our family has always done. We never enslaved people, Fawn said. But we've always killed them, Alpha said. You'll get over it. I did. The people at the bottom want to be there. They don't care about rules or the future. They just want to be taken care of. Who cares how they live, Alpha said. She could hardly believe the words had come from his mouth. He sounded more callous than Deicide, and this time the words were his own. He was one of them. He had thrown away his ideals in order to hold these wicked beliefs closer to his chest. The wars they had witnessed had been different for them both. They fought for their own agency, for their country's sovereignty. Now Alpha cared for nothing except his own comfort. The misery he caused enabled him to own more things. If he snuffed out the rebels in his county, he was sure to be promoted and given an estate. It was then that she realized that the Yolopau's main function as a machine was to transfer agency back to Deicide. For what? She did not know. But she knew that the only way to free these people would be to break down their toxic culture. They could hear a crowd forming on the plaza. Fawn looked to Alpha and then moved to the door. It slid open to reveal a group of Sicaris, the hard-faced extremists that looked at Deicide like a living god. They had no name tapes on their uniforms, but from their faces, she could see that these were the soldiers that very few ever saw regularly. Deicide's secret police, recruited from a pool of the secular believers. These personnel very rarely circulated in the general population on board the Yolopau, unless on official business. Their veins were black from the vestige in their veins, faces scarred from thousands of confrontations with Deicide's enemies. They wore no skids, their skins and muscles hardened from the toxic chemicals consuming their flesh. It was said that when one had absorbed enough untreated vestige material, that they could never refuse an order from Deicide. Their minds were imprisoned by his words. Fawn thought about fighting. She was sure she could catch 2 of them off guard, but even if she escaped, there were sure to be hundreds of other idle soldiers waiting outside. Come with us, one said, black smoke spilling over his teeth. Fawn could smell the sickening odor once more. Her head hung low as she swallowed the saliva gushing into her mouth. She closed her eyes and belched, hoping her stomach would settle if she took deep breaths. You too, Lieutenant, another said. They walked with the nameless men out into the plaza, through the crowd of questioning onlookers. Fawn only saw faces filled with pity staring back at her as she walked in the center of the men. Alpha whispered advice on what might happen next, but Fawn was focused on keeping her stomach from turning inside out. They took a gate into a hangar filled with ships and maintenance personnel running about, and then out into a dark passageway. Fawn strained her eyes in the tricky lighting, thinking she could see the toy box at the feet of the dark figure. As the darkness began to waft around the passageway, she knew it was Deicide in the abyss. As they approached, the smell grew unbearably stronger, and Fawn retched several times before emptying the contents of her stomach. A thick gray paste surged from her throat and clung to the wall. She had no memory of eating anything even close to its texture. She spit what had not made its way out of her stomach, and glanced up at Deicide, who was only a few inches from her. He seemed concerned, but Fawn thought it was just because she had just puked into his communications box. Deicide gestured to the open door. This planet is occupied by your allies, Deicide said. Fawn looked to her things in front of him, and then to the glowing red tips of his antennas. Why? Fawn said. Just kill me and be done with it. Destroying life is not as easy as you believe, Deicide said, reaching out to touch her, but stopped short. Even those that you know would slash your throat if given the chance. Fawn spit once more and stood up straight, feeling slightly better now that the slop was out of her system. She noticed the three of them were alone. The nameless soldiers had slipped away without her notice. Even then, she was still guarded. Her eyes constantly checked Deicide's shoulders, watching the abyss watch her. She tossed a quick glance to her brother, who was standing completely still, probably thinking that Deicide would not notice him if he did so. The hold Deicide had on some of his soldiers seemed almost godly. Only the most outspoken of them were not cowed in his presence. She knew now that those soldiers who were grossly familiar with the Eater were of his blood. All of them, brown, beige, and yellow, freckled, wide-eyed, or narrow. No matter their mother, they all had his cynical smirk, though none of them possessed the sad look of his eyes. "Alfie?" Fawn said, looking toward her brother. He avoided her gaze, and instead looked to the ground, and then to Deicide. "We have to stay together," Fawn said. Alpha said nothing. "Alpha! We'll be all right. You don't need this." "Soon there will be no place where the Yola pile is not," Deicide said. "Fawn, I can't go. I'm sorry," Alpha said, before he turned away. "You condone this? You allow a man to turn his back on his sister, on his blood," Fawn said. "Alpha proposed I keep you here against your will, because he thought that I would execute you otherwise," Deicide said. "It is you who is abandoning him. Do you really believe that you'll survive another deathless rush?" "I've survived worse," Fawn said. "Only because we were looking for you," Deicide said. Fawn took a deep breath, and her eyes found their way to the portal that was being activated in place of the door. Deicide grabbed her gear, as well as some supplementary survival equipment. "You've been lucky your entire life, until I became aware of your existence," Deicide said, tossing the toy box and her gear through the portal. "Now you live in a fragile shell made out of my patience." Deicide grabbed both of her arms and pulled her close. "Pray that it holds," he said, as he shoved her through the portal and into the darkness.